No one has ever died of hunger because they didn't have time to eat. That's one of the things Father Philippe wrote in his book Time for God when he compared eating to prayer. In the book, the author addressed the most common problems and questions regarding prayer. He writes about how to find time for prayer, what the proper disposition or mindset for prayer is, what to do during prayer, so how to actually pray, and he also gives advice regarding the perfect time, place, and posture for prayer. Finally, he also explains how to deal with common temptations during prayer, like for example when you can't focus. Like in all his other books, Father Philippe gives very practical advice regarding the topic of prayer, which I will summarize in this video now. Before I do that, let me give you a brief introduction to the author. The book was published in 1992 by Father Jacques Philippe, who is a 76-year-old religious brother and priest from France. Fun fact about him is that before becoming a religious brother, he studied mathematics in college and spent several years teaching and doing scientific research before entering the monastery. And now let's start with the content of the book. In general, the book tells us that we should not rely too much on methods or exercises to improve our prayer life, because we need to center our prayer on God and not on ourselves. We must recognize that only God can lead us forward in our spiritual life. This means that all of us, regardless of our technical skills, can have a profound prayer life if we respond faithfully to God's grace. Father Philippe reminds his readers that prayer is not a technique to be mastered, but a gift from God. And what is most important during prayer is not the methods, but the inner attitudes that enable us to receive His grace. Our primary task is to strive to cultivate these attitudes during prayer, and the rest will be God's work. The main point is that in prayer, the important thing is not what we do, but what God does in us. Sometimes, even if we do nothing or feel nothing special during prayer, God is at work in our hearts in ways we cannot see. The essential thing for prayer is simply to be present before God with an attitude of trust and abandonment. We shouldn't judge our prayer by what we feel during that time or by the ideas we contemplate during that time, but instead we should allow God to act in us. The author explains that Saint Therese of Lisieux understood this very well. Sometimes she would fall asleep during prayer, but she didn't worry. She knew that God saw her weakness and she accepted it and offered it up. Father Philippe reminds us that the most important thing in prayer is to be receptive to God's action. It's normal to have times when we cannot pray well, but at those times we should offer our weakness to God. Our prayer will be more valuable than we think, even if it doesn't leave us satisfied. Apart from that, the author highlights the importance of faithfulness and perseverance in prayer. It's not that important to have a beautiful prayer which is rich in ideas, but rather it's important to be faithful and persevere in prayer even if we get distracted. Father Philippe also writes that regular and faithful prayer is more valuable than sublime but rare moments of prayer. The author also talks about how praying isn't just about talking to God, but that it's also about listening to what God might say to us. He also warns against the idea that we should only pray when we feel like it. Instead, we should pray regularly, even if we don't feel like it. Father Philippe says that there is no one right way to pray that would work for everyone. Each person must discover how God wants to lead them. And also, one's prayer life changes over time. What works at one time may not work at another. For example, there are uplifting times and times of struggle during prayer. Apart from the principles I mentioned before, another important aspect of a good prayer life is the realization that to love is the most important thing to do during prayer. Saint Teresa of Avila said that in prayer, the crucial thing is not to think much, but to love much. Sometimes we cannot think or feel much, but we can always love. Here, loving means a conscious decision and not necessarily feeling this love, because as I just mentioned, it's not always possible to feel much during prayer. Even when we're tired or distracted, we can offer our love to the Lord, and that's a great prayer. Father Philippe writes that loving God and letting ourselves be loved by Him is our main task in prayer. This can be difficult because we often doubt God's love and feel inadequate, so it's difficult to accept being loved by God when we feel like we're not doing anything and when we feel like we're not productive. But we must accept our frailty and believe in His love for us. The basis of our relationship with God is to recognize that He loved us first. Apart from that, Father Philippe stressed that our prayer should tend towards simplicity. Sometimes deep thoughts during prayer can be a temptation if they take us away from an authentic connection with God. Father Philippe writes that true prayer is a simple act of love, and the more we advance in our spiritual life, the simpler our prayer becomes. Now let's talk about the ideal time, place, and posture for prayer. Father Philippe writes that we can pray at any time, but it's better to choose times when we are more relaxed and less worried. Sometimes we can't choose the ideal time, and that's okay. The important thing is to make prayer a habit, and so to make it a normal part of our lives. When it comes to the ideal amount of time dedicated to prayer, Father Philippe says that 5 minutes a day is not enough, and that a quarter of an hour is the minimum. Here I'd like to quote a monk whom I asked the question how long people should pray for during the day, and he replied, more than they do now. And I really like that approach because for a person who currently doesn't pray at all, praying for 5 minutes a day is a great progress. And for someone who prays more, it's good to remember that they should always try to improve. As my dad likes to say, the moment you stop making spiritual progress, you start regressing. Ultimately, we should pray without ceasing. That's 1 Thessalonians 5:17. Of course, it's not possible to, for example, pray rosaries all day because most people have to go to work, etc. But in that case, we can always offer up that activity, which then also counts as prayer. Father Philippe also explains that it's better to make short but regular prayers than long but infrequent ones. As for the place, we can pray anywhere, but it's helpful to have a quiet, special place for it. A chapel with the Blessed Sacrament would be ideal, but we can also create a quiet corner with a religious image at home. So the author encourages having a place dedicated to prayer at home. Here I'd like to mention an anecdote that allegedly happened to Saint Teresa of Avila, so regarding the whole thing where you can pray and where not. Apparently, she liked to pray everywhere, including the toilet. And one day the devil came to her and criticized that praying while on the toilet wasn't reverent. Saint Teresa is said to have replied, "What comes out of my mouth in prayer is for God. What comes out the other end is for you." Finally, the author writes some things regarding the posture during prayer. He says that we can pray sitting, kneeling, prostrating, standing, or lying down, whatever feels most comfortable for us. The important thing is to be comfortable, but also alert, so we need a posture that helps us concentrate on God and not be easily distracted. Talking about distraction, let's transition now to difficulties when prayer. During prayer, we might face difficulties such as dryness or distraction. The author points out that these difficulties are normal and we shouldn't worry too much about them. In fact, they can be good for purifying our love for God and strengthening our faith. Here I'd like to recommend the book The Dark Night of the Soul, which essentially talks about just that, when we are purified and strengthened by the fact that we experience dryness and a dark night of the soul during prayer. In conclusion, the author says that we shouldn't be discouraged by those distractions and difficulties during prayer, but we should persevere. And if these difficulties last for too long, it's helpful to seek the help of a spiritual director. Another common problem during prayer are distractions, and we shouldn't feel too worried about being distracted, but simply turn our minds again to God whenever we realize that we were distracted. Even if our prayer consists of struggling with distractions, God appreciates it. It's impossible to avoid distractions altogether, but the important thing is to persevere in prayer nevertheless. St. Francis de Sales used to say that even if the only thing we do during prayer is fighting distractions, our prayer is well made. Now let's get to my opinion on the book. I would give the book a 9 out of 10, essentially for the same reasons as with the book Interior Freedom, which I reviewed last time. The content is very practical and easy to understand, and I think that you know after watching this video whether you'd like to read the book or not. The only reason the rating isn't higher is because I think that you can find the content of his book in other sources as well, and you might be already familiar with his advice regarding prayer. If that's not the case, I can only recommend his book. That's been it for today. I hope you liked the video. See you next time. God bless and bye!